Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me here. I'm going to be talking about hope in the time of crisis. But before I begin, I would like to just take a few seconds to have a mindful pause for all the people we know that need our compassion, need our thanks, and need our strength in order to carry on. So if you just take a moment and send your best thoughts, prayers, and wishes. Thank you. Uh, Today, what I'm going to be talking about is the science of hope. And there's been some radical new changes, some things that are absolutely extraordinary, in my opinion, that we can use. And we can use that right now. To begin, I want to talk about positive and negative emotions because hope is really a unique positive emotion. And you're going to learn more about that as we go on. But in general, what we have is that negative emotions tend to restrict us. These are things like fear and flight. We talk about this all the time, this fight or flight response. And that's what happens when we have a negative emotion. It pulls us in and it pulls us down. But with positive emotions, we have a very different reaction. They tend to build us up and build resources. Once we get activated with positive emotions, it seems as if these positive emotions broaden and build our connections to other people, as well as our own creative resources. If you would, to take a moment and just look at the very edge of this mountain, look at the top of it, and then take a look at its reflection in the lake below. I want you to see if the edge of that mountain, its landscape, and the reflection below are an accurate reflection of one another. Now, as you're doing that, I'm going to invite you to put your left ear on your left shoulder and take a look at that image again. What you should notice is that all the way on the left-hand side, you'll see the head of an adult in prayer pose, and then a child in front of that adult in prayer pose. The edge of the mountain up here are the shoulders of the adult. And down here, this rock becomes the edge of the shoulders of the child. Nothing changed in what you saw. What changed was how you looked at it. That image stayed identical in both ways of seeing it. And that's really where we're going with positive psychology and the science of hope. It's not what's out there that matters so much as how we look at it, how we interpret it. I'm a positive psychologist, and this is required for me to show during every presentation. You know the questions that go along with this, right? If I ask those questions, I've left you with the impression that there are only two possible answers when the truth of the matter is this glass is completely full, half with water and half with air. It's actually a more accurate answer, but we often don't see that answer if we're given a limited set of questions. So part of positive psychology and part of hope is learning how to look at things in a different way and see past the questions that we're being given. If you take a look at an image like this, you'll see where we're going with hope and with positive psychology. The ability to look at things in more than one way at the same time. If you look at this image, you'll be able to flip back and forth between it being a profile and then half a face facing you straight on. Both ways of seeing are possible. It's not that we're trying to ignore negative images or negative thoughts or negative perspectives. We're trying to balance them. That's what's key here, that we're balancing our perspective by learning how to look at it in a different way. Now, this next image, I'd like you to see what happens the moment you look at it. So it's intriguing. This is an image you've not seen before, and yet you already have a sense that maybe there's another way to look at this. That's what we're doing in the science of hope. We're teaching how people can be more hopeful by learning to look at things in a different way. So we get some practice in some early things, and then we're able to look at new things with a completely unique set of lens. I've likened negative thoughts to pebbles and positive thoughts to feathers. Pebbles are heavier than feathers. And so when we think about how could we possibly balance this out, uh, often people think one great big thing is going to do it, some big positivity. You get married or get the job you want or something that you think is really going to be an achievement or a big thing in your life. Well, the truth of the matter is no one big positive thing balances out a lot of our negativity. We need a lot of little things to balance it out. It really looks a little more like this. Can the feathers actually balance out the pebbles? Can our positive thoughts balance out the negative ones? They sure can. Negative thoughts are stronger than positive thoughts because of something known as the negativity bias. Evolution has prepped us in a certain way to worry. Jack and Sam are outside the cave and Jack says, I'm going to go in the cave and see what all those noises are about. And Sam says, I'm going to stay out here. Well, Sam's genes get passed on to us because he was a worrier. So worrying, having a negative perspective, is actually woven into our DNA. Can it be balanced out? Absolutely. But positive thoughts need to be plentiful. We need a lot of little ones in order to make this scale, first of all, get balanced. And second of all, perhaps tip it in the other direction. Over the last couple of years, I've been doing the research on hope, and I've put together a book on learned hopefulness. I've been taking a look at all the different research from all corners of the world and have tried to put together a theory and a way of understanding hope that gives us some fresh perspectives and the opportunity to use hope in our daily lives and with the people that we work with. One of the first things I learned is that the researchers who were looking at hope were all doing it, not really paying a heck of a lot of attention to one another. It's like the parable of the blind men who grab a different part of the elephant and believe that the elephant looks like what they're holding on to. So if they hold on to the tail, it looks like a rope. If they hold on to the ear, it looks like a fan. If they touch the side, it looks like a wall. They all have a piece of what's true, but they really didn't have a clear understanding of how hope worked. One of the things that became more and more obvious is that the medical researchers weren't really reading the psychological researchers who really weren't taking a look at what the educators had done. As I put the book together, there were several people that I was very lucky to have endorsed the work. The reason why I put this up here is to highlight the fact that these are folks who come from very, very different disciplines. These are folks who have done longitudinal studies, researchers in psychology, researchers in education, business people. What we're able to see is that hope has value almost in any domain we look at. What I mean by learned hopefulness is that we're trying to cultivate a belief that we can optimize our influence in the future. Uh, Belief systems are really at the core of what we're trying to look at. Years back, they used to have behavior modification. Well, in order to study hope, we need belief modification. We're trying to understand what high hope people do, people who have very high levels of hope and function very well, and what people with low hope do so that we can learn from these two groups. Along the way, there were 5 myths about hope that became very obvious as I looked at it, and I want to share them with you now. The first one is that hope is a purely positive emotion. Well, that's not true. It is unique among all the positive emotions because it requires negativity or uncertainty to be activated. That's a deal breaker. When we look at positive emotions like joy or bliss or awe, things like that, they don't need negative emotions to jumpstart them. And negative emotions certainly don't need positive emotions to jumpstart them. But hope is right in the middle. It's the only one that requires negativity or uncertainty to be activated. Well, with COVID-19, those two raw emotions are perhaps more prominent now than at any other time in history. So the ingredients for hope are there. The second myth is that hope influences our belief system. It actually ends up being the other way around. What happens is our belief system will influence our sense of hope. If you just think about what a pharmaceutical company has to do in order to get a medicine approved, it has to go up against the placebo effect. So just to think about that, the placebo effect is maybe our greatest statistical measure of hope because all we have to do is believe that something will work and it changes our outcome. That's kind of powerful. So our belief system influences the degree of hope we have. Our third myth is that hope is the same as faith. Actually, when we get down to this part, this is the difference between how scientists study hope and how we use hope in our general vocabulary. Often we say hope, but we really mean faith. If I say, gee, I hope tomorrow is a good day, that's not what the researchers are talking about. It's really that we have faith that there's going to be a good day tomorrow. Here's the difference. Hope is when we feel we can positively impact our future. Faith is when we've surrendered that to something greater. So there was a great discussion I had heard back in the day from Catfish Hunter, who was a pitcher, and he was being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And he was talking about all the things he did to control the baseball. And how he worked hard in the off season and his arm and how he had to, be really careful and then work very hard for it and then practice under different conditions. And he said, but at some point I have to let that ball go and I have no way of knowing what's going to happen after I let it go. That to me is a perfect definition of the difference between hope and faith. If I do my part and I can control everything I can control about how I think the future is going to be, then there's a part where I have to let it go. So it's the belief that we can have influence over the future. But then when we can't have that influence, or we let that influence go to a different source, well, when we do that, that it becomes faith. I was invited, believe it or not, to speak at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Was an extraordinary experience. And I was invited to speak on the nature of this difference between hope and faith. And when I was asked to be there, um, in preparing, I put together a number of quotes, and this is one of my favorites. Hope is faith holding out its hand in the dark. The reason I like this is that it tells us about the applied nature of hope. Hope is really the functional and applied aspects of this. Faith is something that we don't have control over. We believe in, we think about, but we can't actually control. Myth number four is that hope is regulated by circumstance. It tends not to be that way, although it might appear that if we have a particular circumstance in front of us, the amount of hope we have in that circumstance will be high or low depending on what we're confronted with. But the truth is hope is regulated by calibration and correction rather than circumstance. Let me give you an example of what I mean. There was a client I worked with many, many years ago, was when I was a young therapist. And I was working with her for about 6 months and actually had no improvement at all. She was arguably one of the most depressed people I've ever worked with. And as a new therapist, I was kind of anxious about finding ways to get her to change and to feel better. And although she came very regularly to the sessions and showed up, I would give her all kinds of tasks to do or things to do, and she wouldn't do them and then show up the next week. And I was really becoming frustrated and not sure that I was the right person to help her. She always showed up on time, except for this one day. She came in about 10 minutes late, and under her arm was a package of paper plates. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm late, but I stopped to pick up paper plates." Well, I was probably an optimistic psychologist back then, and I was all excited. And I said, "Oh, that's great. Are you going to have a party or a gathering?" And she was looking at me like, "No." So her backstory was that her husband had left her after 20 plus years of marriage, and he had left her for a younger woman, and she felt miserable about herself. She had no control over the situation, was alone in the house, and was really kind of slipping into a chronic depression because she said, "Who's going to want me now?" She had let her body go. She had stopped exercising. She wasn't doing anything to keep up her regular appearance. And so when I saw the paper plates, I thought, oh, maybe she's going to be social rather than isolated. But she said, no, I just ran out of plates. And I didn't quite understand what she was talking about. And she explained that she would get a dish and have her meal on it. And then the next day or the next meal, she'd move over to another section of the plate. And so she could get 4 or 5, sometimes 6 meals by just kind of doing that and moving it around. Then when the plate was really crusty and dirty, she'd put it on the side and then grab another plate. And she was saying, I, uh, I just have gone through all my plates now. So that's why I need paper plates. Well, I was stunned. I really didn't know what to say. My big intervention was to say, what? Why don't you just wash the plates? Well, she looked at me like I had 3 heads and said, you think that's going to bring my husband back? You think that's going to make me feel better about myself? Washing the plates isn't going to change my situation. I'll just use paper plates. Well, we spent the entire session arguing about the value of this. And I tried to negotiate with her. And I said, you have a whole week between sessions. All I want you to do is wash one plate and come on back and tell me what that felt like. Well, it ended up that she called me that night and she was beside herself. She was excited. She was jubilant. She said, I washed one plate. It felt so good. Made me want to wash another and another and another. And after I finished all the plates, I started cleaning the closets. I started looking at the drawers and the mess that was around. Well, that was a turning point in her therapy. My point about this story is that it was calibration. We were correcting the goal. The goal was to have this control over your future, have a marriage, have a plan, have all of that sort of stuff. And when that was gone, there was nothing else that she could get tread on. But once she started to control what she could control in her immediate environment and get immediate feedback about these micro goals, these calibrated goals, she was able to feel empowered. Small, it doesn't sound like washing a dish could turn your life around, but they're cumulative. And that's the point about this pebbles and feathers thing. We need a lot of feathers to tip the scale. And that's a way that you can start to think about elements in your own life and elements in the life of others, small things that you can do to help them. Myth number 5, you either have hope or you don't. Well, it's not quite like that. It tends to be that small elements of positivity can activate, regulate, and facilitate our sense of hope. So saying things like thank you, noticing where you can be kind, having compassion for someone, expressing compassion. All of these things seem incredibly small. I remember when I was first learning about this, when I was going through a depression and somebody said, well, count your blessings, have gratitude. I was like, it's a pea shooter going up against a, um, a battleship. How could these small acts of kindness or gratitude influence anything? Well, the truth is, it shifts our perception all the way back to that. If you start looking for good things, you start finding them. And then there's a phenomenon known as broaden and build. You not only start to find them, you really go on a search for them. It's hunting and gathering towards these positive elements that starts to shift your way of thinking. So one of the first things I encourage people to do is to start a very serious gratitude list. I probably know 3 dozen techniques and probably another 2 dozen that I could look up if I needed to. But the truth is they're all tools in the toolbox. And the number one tool I use is counting my blessings, making sure that I review all the things I have gratitude for, at least 3 of them each morning. Now, there's mixed research about how many times you should do that. I try to do that every day, knowing that some days I'll just be preoccupied with something else. But if you get to do that 4 or 5 days a week, something happens. Because as you wake up and you start counting those gratitudes, making a list of them in the beginning, it starts to shift your perception about what's possible. That is a game changer. It also lets you know, once you do it several times, that something's going to happen today that you have tremendous gratitude over, tremendous toward. You're going to look for that the next day. So there's an expectation that gets built in. And during the day, it might not even seem like you have that much gratitude for something. But then when you review it, either at the beginning or end of your day, it ends up being a powerful way to move forward. The science of hope in a time of crisis involves a couple of different things. The most important here are the decisions we make when we're confronted with a difficulty. So if you were to take a look at this list, some of the research from the book identified high hope and low hope people. Well, what do we know about the high hope people? Well, they see possibilities. They notice the good things. They cultivate positive feelings. They focus on strengths. They adjust their goals. They engage with purpose and they cherish others. If you look at the left side, you'll see the things that limit hope. And it becomes pretty clear that you're going to want to try to move toward the right-hand side. So I'd like to discuss these 7 decisions because we have 100,000 thoughts a day. The estimate is between 70,000 and 120,000, right? We have all of these thoughts. And that means we have lots of decisions to make. And how we decide to look at what's happening to us will start to create a wave of positivity or a downward spiral of negativity. Having hope is not easy. It requires shifting your lens and looking for these 7 things. So let's take a look at this, right? When we're confronted with a change, when we're confronted with something that forces us to change or we want to have change in our life or perhaps some combination of both, we really want to take a look at how do the high hope people see adversity and convert it into opportunity. Instead of seeing something as being negative, as being overwhelming, they start to look for possibilities. They don't see this change as an obstacle. They see it as a challenge or an opportunity. So let's take a look at this. The first is that they don't have a fixed mindset. I've been talking more these days, and I'll mention it a little later on, about a transformational mindset. But basically, if a fixed mindset says, this is the way things are, I don't think I can change. I can't change out there. I can't change here. And they get stuck. And when you get stuck like that, there's a saying, the only difference between a rut and a grave is the depth, right? When you get stuck like that, you're on a downward spiral. So if you see things as fixed and unchangeable, it starts jamming your way of looking at the world with more hope and more optimism. So the high hope people see possibilities and they've trained themselves. If I can go back to the mountain and lake thing, after one very brief exposure to looking at things differently, you learn that it's possible to see something different. That second image, if I had shown you that first, you wouldn't have thought to change your perspective on it. You would have just seen it for what it was. The second thing is that high people intentionally focus on beauty, benefits, and blessings. They do not concentrate on the negatives. One of the things I found in doing research for the book Learned Hopefulness is that there's really good reason why we have these adages. Stop and smell the roses. Well, there's really, really good reason why that's stuck around. High-ho people are looking for all the good stuff. They wake up in the morning on that search. They are not ignoring negativity. That's really important. They're not ignoring that, but they're looking for the balance. They're looking for more feathers to put on the other side of that pebble. People who score higher on measures of hope cultivate positive emotions. What I mean by that is they look for opportunities to be kind. When they spot kindness, they acknowledge it. Kindness is one of the more ubiquitous things in the world once you start looking for it. And it's got a phenomenon associated with it called elevation. Elevation basically means if I do an act of kindness for somebody else, I feel good and the person receiving the kindness feels good. But with elevation, somebody else watching us feels just as good. Haven't you seen it either on Instagram or, something where you're watching the social media, you look at it and you hear about or see a video of somebody's tremendous act of kindness. And doesn't it warm you up? It stimulates our vagus nerve. It gives us a higher vagal tone because we feel connected. We're wired also for moral beauty. So when we see something that's that cool, we get inspired. It often makes us want to do something kind. And then there are the strengths. I would imagine most of you listening to this already know about the VIA Character Strength Survey. So if you go to viacharacter.org, this organization is worldwide. They have over 10 million people in the database. People with high hope very naturally use their strengths and they strength spot others because what it means is they're looking toward other people to use their strengths. They're not trying to cram them into a mold that there's only one way to be, but they honor the fact that there is uniqueness and that when they can and they're able to use their strengths, they know that they can flourish. Creating challenging goals is really the trademark of high hope people. And what I was saying before about the wash one dish things, it's always about recalibration. If you have a goal, I'm going to run an 8-minute mile, and you run an 8-minute and 30-second mile. Well, it's not that you failed, right? You didn't reach that goal, but now the next goal might be an 8:20. It's a recalibration. The idea is to not just be despondent because you didn't reach this goal, but to set other goals that challenge you in different ways. Sometimes those goals are micro goals. And one of the things that I mean by micro goals is that something that takes 20 or 30 minutes during your day, particularly during this pandemic, that is incredibly important because it means it has a beginning, middle, and end. It grabs your interest. You have a sense of accomplishment when it's done. I mean, I wrote an article recently about making a meal because if you can think about how good it is to make a meal, you realize I'm taking care of this moment. I'm chopping the carrots for the soup, but I'm also thinking about boiling the water, getting the other vegetables. My mind is completely absorbed in a goal that has a presence in the moment and something slightly in the future. It's the best of all worlds because once we achieve that, once we accomplish that, it fills us up in a really powerful way. So it's not the big goals where how much you want to make for the year or what you're going to do. It's the moment to moment goals that really fill us up. As we move on, our sense of meaning and purpose become more and more important. And I would venture a guess that every person on the planet has had their sense of meaning and purpose shake it up. What we thought was maybe our goal or our mission has changed. And some people might have to accelerate that. I certainly know for me, the work I've done on hope, I had a much more leisurely plan in my head of how this was going to happen. It all had to happen faster. My sense of purpose and meaning shifted literally within a couple of days, realizing that I had this research that I wanted to bring out. Other people might have to pivot to something completely different because what they thought they were going to do, they had to change. What's important here is that doing things that have meaning and purpose connected to them, our reason for living is going to become an important challenge as we move forward and is really at the core of what high hope people strive for. Finally, those low in hope often choose isolation, while those high in hope make choices that cherish and nurture connection with others. That connection, as this one is today, is about using our abilities to make connections. And I'm sure people on this call have already done this. You have your virtual happy hour with friends. Get to see my grandson and my daughter and son-in-law. They're up in New Hampshire. I get to see them and have the joy of watching Callahan, my grandson, eat the FaceTime. Uh, he wants to kind of take me in. All of those things have value. Smaller connections. One of the things I noticed that I have friends around the world. I can connect with them. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Small things that we can do now. Might not be able to travel there. Might not be able to have some big meeting at a conference, but we can do it this way. And that, again, is characteristic of high hope people. They broaden their connections and deepen them at the same time. I'll just mention very, very briefly that in the earlier part of April here in 2020, there was a survey done in Britain, and it was fascinating. I just wrote an article about it. Just absolutely fascinating. Only 9% of Britons want to go back to the way things were. They don't, only 9% said they wanted to go back to their normal life. 85% said, I want changes in the future. And most of those changes had to do with their community connection and their personal connections. 40% of them said that they had better connections now, more connections now, a greater sense of community and bond with their family and friends because of this. So this, again, becomes really important for understanding how hope works. This leads us to understanding coping strategies. So I want to talk about a couple of them to give us a flavor as to how they work. The first one, regressive coping, is systematic avoidance. Not recommended. It tends to create a cycle, which I'll share with you in a moment, that puts us on a downward path. Transformational coping, a transformational mindset, is really where we're at with hope. We're taking something that feels negative, is initially interpreted as negative or uncertain, and we're learning how to transform it. The Buddhists have a phrase for this: no mud, no lotus. And it means that sometimes the things that are going to flourish come out of the mud in our life. And then finally, proactive coping, and I'll talk about that because it seems to be some very new research, literally just a couple of weeks old, has shown us that the people who are thriving are people who can be both present and plan a little bit for the future. They want to plan to reduce future stress or thrive downstream. If you can be in both places in the moment and have a bit of planning, you're in the best of all worlds. So let's take a deeper look at these three. The first is regressive coping. When a crisis comes along and we have a struggle or a difficulty that we're up against, something negative or uncertain has walloped us, then our reaction might be, I don't want to deal with this. Almost every piece of research I know about conflict says move toward the conflict. But if it feels too difficult and we avoid it, the avoidance gets us off this hook in the short run, but fuels our negative emotions in the long run. In other words, our depression, anger, guilt, and resentment seem to ferment as a result of this avoidance. So it works because it kind of gets us off of having to deal with the crisis, but it fuels the depression, anger, guilt, and resentment, which lowers our self-esteem. We have lower self-esteem because we know we never really dealt with this. We never actually dealt with it. And that weakens us in terms of moving toward the next crisis. So what happens? We'll avoid that one. And as you can see in this downward cycle, we are constantly weakened in terms of our ability to deal with the next thing that comes along. So the natural way to start dealing with this is to move toward the crisis. Start finding ways to deal directly with it. And that brings us to transformational coping. The idea here is asking yourself what can be done. Not just saying, gee, I hope things get better. It's much more, what can I do to make things better? It's that personal sense that I can do something to control the future. And again, back to the dish, you might not be able to control 99% of what's happening, but you can wash a dish. You can find something in your immediate environment that you have control over. And my encouragement is go deal with that, because that is dealing with the crisis directly. Because you're saying, okay, I can't control this. It comes back to the serenity prayer, right? What you can and can't control. I can't control that, but I can control this. So let me go do that. Might only be 20 minutes, but that's going to give me a little bit of positivity. And what we know about positive emotions is that they'll gravitate to more positive emotions. That's the burden and build theory by Barbara Fredrickson. It means that once we get this started going in the right direction, it kind of has a life of its own. Um, this is when I was putting this together, the saying on the left-hand side, sometimes when you're in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but actually you've been planted. I found this, was finishing up the slide deck, and I walked outside, and right outside my door were these buds, such a beautiful sign of spring and hope. And I was like, all right, I got to take this picture and put it down here. And just to elaborate for a moment, can you imagine the life of a seed? right? First of all, it has no idea what it's going to become. It knows it's got some potential, but it doesn't really know what it is, right? We stick it in the ground and all the things that it needs, sunlight, right? Nutrients, water. It's in a shell. It doesn't even know how it's going to get that. But somehow it does. The roots go down, right? The shoots go up, and it starts to strive for those nutrients. And that's part of this transformation, to recognize that it might be dark, but it doesn't mean that what you need isn't available. So proactive coping. This, of course, is from Star Wars. Be mindful of the future, but not at the expense of the moment. Well, they got it. They had the right idea, but they had it reversed. Here's what the research says. Be mindful of the moment, but not at the expense of the future. What that means is this new research says that if you're mindful, that's good. And if you're thinking about the future, that's good, how to have a positive impact. But the best of all worlds is when you can combine those. So I tried to think of where is a natural place where that happens. The natural place seems to be in meal preparation. I've wondered why Alexa every morning's got some other recipe, and recipes now during the pandemic, like people, how to make chocolate waffles. Okay. It's like, what, why? Well, because preparing food ends up being one of the perfect ways to demonstrate this, right? If you've ever watched a really good cook, or maybe you're a good cook, when you're chopping the carrots for the soup, man, you are 100% there. But there's part of your mind also calculating, when do I turn the word or when do I get the other vegetables? When do I do this? And what happens is during those precious moments, you're both in the moment and slightly anticipating what you can do for the next block of time to either reduce your stress or make things better. When you're in that world, you're not worrying about the past, you're not worrying about the future, you're engaged. And what we know about positive emotions is that engagement is the real deal. That's why we set the goals. That's why we do all these other things. Because once you're engaged in what you're doing, that gives you that oasis. That gives you that period of time where you're liberated. You're not thinking about anything else but the very task in front of you. So as we're coming to a close here, I want to say that hope is a verb. Hope is about doing something. And I want to just show you the actual definition of hope as a verb down on the bottom. You want something to happen or be the case, or you expect, anticipate, look for, wait for, or be hopeful of. Eh, I think that's the old definition of hope. What I'm striving for and sharing all this research is make something happen. And don't wait for something to happen. Make it happen. I want to share here at the end the 7 decisions. I want to show them to you again and give you a challenge. I'd like you to take a look at these. And in particular, on the far right, the 7 things that are essential for increasing high hope. And I'm going to ask you to think about where you are with these 7, and maybe pick the one where you're a little bit more on the left-hand side than you'd want to be, and specifically what it is you might do to move that over to the right side. Don't pick more, if you're all 7 on the left side, I'm sorry to hear that. But only pick 1 or 2. Norman Vincent Peale said it back in the day: change your thoughts and you change your world. And nothing could be truer from all the new research for learned hopefulness. Um, your belief systems, your thoughts are really the front wheels of your car. They're going to take you in whatever direction you take them. You take them to the left, they're going to go to the left. Take them to the right, they're going to go to the right. And if you put the front wheel on the left side this way and the right one this way, you're not going anywhere. So it's really about assessing where you're at and then making some decisions to move in the high hope direction. I have some resources and I keep adding to this. So if you were to text hopeful to 44222, you'll get an opt-in email. You send your email and you'll instantly get something back that will give you access to resources. Um, and those resources have articles and some research and things that might be helpful to you. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to do this presentation. My email is on the bottom, hello@dantomasulo.com. If there are any thoughts or questions that you have, please feel free to email me. And my website has new stuff on hope all the time, just at dantomasulo.com. Thanks very much, and I wish you well.